We're fearlessly talking about the biggest stories that matter to you the most. Breaking news, John Calipari is finalizing a 5-year deal to become the Arkansas Razorbacks' next head coach, covering college sports like no one else. The biggest guests in sports. We now welcome in Hall of Famer Jim Calhoun.
Such a pride I had, I came to connect.
The legend, Tim Tebow, joins us.
We'll run it back. I like it.
The legend, Herschel Walker. Welcome in, everybody. Sunday night edition, Aaron Torres Sports Podcast. I'm your host, Aaron Torres. Hope everybody's doing well. Hope everybody's having a great day. And when I tell you, listen, we're blessed to do what we do, but this is one of my favorite shows of the year. We are doing full wall-to-wall reaction, at least on our live stream, of everything to do with the college football playoff and college football playoff selection process. We now have a 12-team bracket, and we're going to break it all down from soup to nuts, beginning to end. We're going to discuss SMU versus Bama. Did the committee get it right? Why I think actually most of the media missed what the real conversation about the playoff even was. We'll talk about ESPN, which felt more like a propaganda machine than anything else. We'll talk about some changes that I do think need to be made. The system isn't perfect. Changes are coming. And then we'll obviously look a little bit at the bracket itself. Who has a nice pathway? Who doesn't? It is a loaded show. By the way, if you're listening on podcast, we will also have a recap of Kentucky, Gonzaga, maybe some other college hoops. But today on the live stream, it is all things college football and college football playoff. Before we get started, a couple quick reminders. One, if you're not subscribed to the Aaron Torres Pod YouTube channel, Aaron Torres Podcast, what are you doing? Shame on you. On YouTube, live streams multiple times a week. We have clips and videos going up every single day. And also, of course, the podcast is available on Apple and Spotify. If you're watching on YouTube, make sure to subscribe. I'm told that if you hit the like button, it helps with the old algorithm. So do your boy Torres a solid. Also, make sure, again, to be subscribed on Apple, Spotify. Just go over there, download a couple old shows just for your boy Torres to pump up those numbers there. Also, before we get started, buddy, we got to thank our partners, our friends. We got to thank Collipuffs.com. Okay, Collipuffs and Collipuffs.com, I should say. So Collipuffs, we've been with them all football season long. Here's the bottom line. It is now December. Holidays are coming. You're on the couch. You're watching football. The playoff now starts 2 weeks earlier. You don't get till New Year's to do. You got college football on December 19th, 20th, into New Year's Day, into mid to late January, and you need a healthy but delicious snack to get you through all those late nights on the couch. Well, my friends, that's where Collipuffs comes in, okay? Family-owned business, not far from where I live. Owner Joey is a football fan, a season ticket holder, and basically he's just like you and I. He was sitting around one day saying, I got to eat something that's a little bit healthier. I want to eat something that is both healthy and delicious. I want something that I'll like, that my kids will like. Well, that's where Collipuffs come in. Baked, not fried, healthy ingredients. They use avocado oil, no grease. It is the alternative to all the junk in your grocery aisle. And here's the best part. You don't have to take my word for how good Collipuffs are. You could try them out for yourself. All you got to do, go to Collipuffs.com. That's Callipuffs.com. You could try them for yourself. You're going to love them. Also available on Amazon.com. So you're on Amazon. You're buying notepads and paper and pens and staplers. I don't know what you buy on Amazon. It's not my business what's in your cart. But if you search Collipuffs, they are available on Amazon as well. You can buy them there. And once you do, you can tell them Torres sent you. Bottom line, get them on Amazon.com. You can also get them on Collipuffs.com. This is the healthy but delicious snack alternative. You're going to love. Just take my word. You're going to love them. We appreciate Collipuffs for their support of the Aaron Torres Pod. With that said, it is a busy Sunday night. Maybe Monday when you're listening, maybe even Tuesday. There is no more time to waste, so let's get to the topic of the day. And the topic of the day, listen, you don't need me to tell you. We have ourselves a college football playoff bracket, but I think as importantly, we have ourselves some major college football controversy, okay? And so listen, let me even, before we get into the controversy, let me tell you what today's show is not going to be about. Big 12 championship game was awesome. Cam Scattlebo was right. It looked like a young Mike Allstott. But this isn't the show where we do 12 minutes on the Big 12 championship game, then we do 10 minutes on the Big 10, then we do 14 minutes on the ACC. No, 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 no. We have a bracket. The analysis of the games are done. And now we have to analyze this bracket. And I think the big conversation, the only conversation that mattered coming into Sunday morning after the games on Saturday was, what do you do with the final at-large spot? We talked about it on Thursday's show. We said, look, we think 11 spots are spoken for. Big 10, 5 conference champs, Big 10, SEC, ACC, Big 12, and of course the Mountain West. You then had, I believed, 6 of the 7 at-large bids spoken for as well. You had the Big 10 runner-up, which was obviously Penn State. The SEC runner-up, which is obviously Texas. You had also, on top of that, you knew that Tennessee was going to get in, that Indiana was going to get in, that I said Penn State, so that Notre Dame was going to get in. So it really ultimately came down to, and Ohio State too. So it ultimately came down to one simple question. We actually talked about it on Thursday's show. What would the committee do with the final spot if SMU lost the ACC championship game? If SMU lost, they'd be an 11-2 team that did not get the automatic bid. And we also knew that Alabama was the highest ranked team not playing in a conference championship game. So we talked about it on Thursday, and we basically said it is going to be an 11-2 Alabama or 11-2 SMU versus a 9-3 Alabama. We broke it down, and that is exactly how it played out. Of course, SMU lost in the ACC championship game on a walk-off field goal, and that was the debate, and that was the conversation, and that was the question going into Sunday. So let's not beat around the bush. Let's get right to it, and let me answer the simple question that I know a lot of you want to talk about and have opinions about, and you can drop your comments and your thoughts in the comment section. The comment section on YouTube is humming, and I promise today we will get to a lot of your comments. But to answer a simple question, because I know a lot of you are thinking it, Torres, where do you stand on this particular topic? To me, I actually thought by the time that we got to Sunday morning, it was essentially a no-brainer. SMU versus Bama. I thought Bama would get in. Let me start over. Let's just pretend like that last 30 seconds never happened. Going into Sunday, it was SMU versus Bama. I thought SMU would get in. SMU does get in. I actually don't think it was even all that controversial, but it certainly created a lot of controversy on the internet. It created a lot of talking points. SMU does, in fact, get the final spot. They ultimately end up as the 11th seed. I think it's kind of weird that they're ranked ahead of Clemson, who they just lost to, but that's another conversation for another day. SMU in, Bama out. Let's discuss why I think the committee actually got it 100% right, and why, frankly, I actually don't even think it's that big of a conversation. By the way, producer Matt, at any point, feel free to pop up the full bracket now that we know what it is, because, again, I'm not going, hey, the 9 seed is this and the 11 seed. No. We're going to talk SMU Bama right now. And when I think about SMU Bama, this is when I realized it was actually sort of no debate, okay? So I go back to Saturday night. I think a lot of you know this. Some of you probably don't. But I host Fox Sports Radio's national recap show every Saturday, 11 p.m. Eastern to 2 a.m. Eastern. I'm not saying it to brag. I'm just saying that I do it every week. And coming into Saturday's show, I was prepping for the show. Remember, we go on at 11 p.m. Eastern. And at that point, SMU was trailing pretty good to Clemson. I said, oh, they're not going to win. This is going to be a topic for our entire 3 hours. We'll probably open up the phone lines, whatever. And so I started kind of looking into SMU's resume. And I said, okay, they're, not a ton of meat on this bone. They're 11-2. They are 0-2 against ranked teams. The only ranked teams they played Clemson in the ACC championship game and lost. They played BYU early in the season and lost. So they went 0-2 against ranked teams, and they went 11-0 against everybody else. So essentially their resume was no great wins, no terrible losses. And that was the conversation going into 11 p.m. Obviously, they lose the game. But as I was prepping for our post-game show at 11 p.m. Eastern on Saturday night, something struck me. And what struck me was this. We were prepping to talk about Texas, Georgia as well. Texas loses to Georgia in the SEC championship game. And one thing became very interesting to me as I actually looked at the resumes. Look at Texas's resume. With the loss to Georgia on Saturday, 11-2 overall. Thank you for the tweet, producer Matt. I truly appreciate it. If you look at Texas's resume after the loss to Georgia, what was their resume? 11-2 overall, 0-2 versus top 25 teams coming into Saturday. So I bring it up because it was like a light bulb going off in my head. I was like, wait a second now. Listen, I'm not saying that you have to make the definitive case that SMU should be in this field, period, let alone over Bama. But what I realized was if you're going to argue that SMU should not be in the playoff field, then you better darn well be arguing the same for Texas. And so to me, it was like a light bulb moment of like, oh my goodness, this resume for Texas is not good. And right now, if you diminish SMU, you basically diminish everybody. And so we got to Sunday morning, and it really kind of resonated with me that we were actually being presented the wrong argument about the 12th spot in the playoff, what ended up being the 11th seed, which went to SMU for days. And I include myself because we did this on Thursday afternoon on our show. We did the SMU versus Bama debate. Well, as it turns out, and I truly believe this, the debate was never about SMU versus Bama. The debate was actually about teams that have no great wins, but no terrible losses. And that's not just SMU. That's Texas. That's Indiana, which, by the way, remember, Indiana, 0 wins over teams in the top 25. Notre Dame's best win is over Army. If you look at purely by the rankings, Penn State, by the way, their best win is over a 9-3 Illinois team. So the debate was never SMU versus Alabama. The debate was actually teams with no good wins, but no bad losses versus teams like Alabama, like Ole Miss, that have some really good wins and some really bad losses. Ole Miss with Kentucky, Alabama with Vanderbilt, and Oklahoma. And so it was just like a light bulb moment. And my whole thing was, if you want to leave out SMU, fine. But basically, SMU's strongest argument going into Saturday had nothing to do with SMU. It was the fact that basically the whole field was kind of in the same ballpark as they were. They were in the ballpark of, wait a second now, they have no great wins, but they have no bad losses as well. So if you punish SMU, you better darn well punish Texas. You better darn well punish Indiana. You better darn well punish Penn State. You better darn well punish Notre Dame. The counter is, if you put in Alabama, you probably got to knock out a bunch of those teams. And so again, I think the conversation was framed wrong. And that was why, to me, it was essentially a no-brainer that SMU was going to get in. Because it wasn't just SMU. It was Texas. It was Penn State. It was all these teams I was talking about. So to me, that was why it was going to be Penn State. I was not surprised. But can I just say this? Can we take 5 minutes to talk about ESPN's coverage of this? Because I tweeted this out and I truly believe it. I think it was among some of ESPN's worst coverage and worst analysis that I have ever seen on that network. And I'm not Mr. Anti-ESPN, but the problem that I had with their conversations were not only, it's not about whether I agree or disagree. It is about the fact that they were making arguments without stating very simple facts. And so I want to dive into this because, again, it didn't even feel like unbiased coverage. It felt like state-run media where we're conveniently leaving out facts that are actually really relevant to the conversation. And before we get into it, let me even backtrack for half a second. I'm not Mr. Anti-SEC. Listen, look at my basketball coverage. I've been on the SEC basketball for years. Auburn, Tennessee, Arkansas, Kentucky, Alabama, whoever. I'm not Mr. Anti-SEC, and I'm certainly not that way in football, okay? I can watch just like everybody else. I understand that the SEC signs the most top recruits. They sign the most best players in the portal. They have the most NFL draft picks. So it doesn't take rocket science. When you bring in the most good players, when you put out the most good players, when you win the most national championships over the last 20 years, there is no doubt in my mind that you're the best conference in college football. Nobody's arguing that. What I would argue, and what was frustrating watching ESPN, was like, we're arguing without even presenting basic facts. Like, again, I turned on ESPN at what was it, noon Eastern, like everybody else. And what was wild to me was this. What it felt like was, I don't know if the talent, either the talent doesn't care, and I'm not here to just tear down Kirk Herbstreit and Nick Saban. I think all those guys work hard. I think they're good. But the talent either didn't realize what the actual conversation was or the producers didn't, because they immediately jumped into the SMU versus Alabama debate. And I'm like, did you guys put together this rundown on Thursday and not change it? Because the conversation has changed, okay? Because if you actually, again, understood the debate, it was never SMU versus Alabama. It was no bad wins, no good wins, no bad losses. Again, SMU, Texas, whatever. No good wins, or some good wins, some bad losses. Alabama, Ole Miss. And so it was frustrating to me because it immediately went to, well, SMU shouldn't be in. Well, Alabama should be in. And this was the frustrating part. It's not that I feel like Alabama definitively should have been out or SMU had to be out or whatever. What it was it was avoiding very simple facts. Like I said, all I heard was SMU. Well, I mean, they why not punish them for being in the conference championship game? SMU, they didn't beat anybody. Why did no one, like I said, and this week I think we have, Matt, is the one where I said something about the tastemakers or whatever. This is what I tweeted. I said ESPN has what we're told are supposed to be thought leaders of college football. And every single one is talking solely about SMU's strength of schedule versus Alabama. You'd think one person would mention that Texas and Indiana have 0 top 25 wins as well. It's embarrassing. And so to me, that was the frustrating part. Not that they immediately jumped into attack mode and, crush SMU's resume and Alabama's the greatest, it's whatever. It's like, if you're going to argue that Alabama should be in and SMU should be out, can one person on that panel, I don't care who it is, Booker McFarland, who I think is good, Booker McFarland, who actually cares about games played on the field, Greg McElroy, who I think is otherwise pretty good, Kirk Herbstreit, who I think is good, can any of you just say, well, you know what? I don't know if I love this SMU resume, but we all understand it's basically the same resume as Texas, right? And again, for people who don't know Texas's resume, I'm just here to tell you, look at it. Their best win is against an 8-4 Texas A&M team. They have a win over 6-6 Vandy. They have a win over 6-6 Arkansas. A win over 6-6 Oklahoma. They don't have great wins. And so again, all I wanted from ESPN during coverage that is supposed to be unbiased is, can you just acknowledge that if we're arguing about SMU, we got to argue about some other teams, including Texas, and don't give me the eye test. Don't give me whatever. Don't give me, oh, they're in the SEC. It just means they're better. Why? They didn't beat anybody good. So I'm sorry. That was a problem. By the way, while we're here, a guy who I otherwise think is pretty good, Nick Saban. Nick Saban, can someone get Nick Saban some straight facts? First of all, love Saban. Greatest college football coach ever. I think he's a great analyst. I think he's been great on College Game Day. I think him and McAfee have a weird vibe that works and they're awesome together. But Nick Saban goes on this rant about, well, here at Alabama, first of all, don't use we, Nick Saban. That's like Media 101. We know you're a little biased. It's okay. You spent 15 years there. That's perfectly fine. But you say, well, we've scheduled Notre Dame and we've scheduled Oklahoma and we've scheduled this and we've scheduled that. And again, this is on a producer. This is on a researcher. If the argument is, and this was a wild argument, by the way, our Torres on Bama account put this out, and I love Drew, who runs Torres on Bama, an intern that is a student at Alabama. I just disagree with him. Like, basically, when Alabama lost, the immediate conversation, and Greg Burns said this as well, like, well, we have to cancel big out-of-conference games because we're not rewarded for strength of schedule. It's like, whoa, wait a second. If you want to argue you're going to be punished for out-of-conference games, let's also acknowledge this. We understand that that SMU played 2 teams from the Power 4 in the out-of-conference. I tweeted this one. I said, will someone tell Nick Saban and ESPN that SMU played 2 out-of-conference Power 4 opponents? Can someone at ESPN prep their talent with obvious facts before they make inaccurate and slanted talking points? Now, listen, there is a conversation to be had about out-of-conference scheduling. First of all, I'll just say this. I think even going into this season, forget this week, I don't understand why the SEC is still scheduling big out-of-conference games, because all it does is give other teams an opportunity to get good wins against your league. Miami was trying to hold up that Florida win 12 weeks after it happened. So I think there's a bigger conversation to have about out-of-conference scheduling. But you can't tell me that Alabama scheduled this insane out-of-conference slate, and then on top of it, don't acknowledge again, and this is on the producers. This is on somebody behind the scenes. Hey, Coach Saban, can you hear me? You understand that SMU played 2 power conference teams, and oh, by the way, played 10 total power conference teams when you include the conference schedule. That's more than Bama. That's more than Texas. That's more than whatever. So again, disappointed by ESPN. But here was the real reason I was disappointed by ESPN. And I was surprised again that nobody took 2 seconds to acknowledge this. Is again, if you want to argue SMU shouldn't be in, I'm not going to fight you on it. There is a legitimate argument to be made. But again, if you argue SMU, you got to argue against Texas, you got to argue against Penn State. But here was my biggest issue that nobody on the entire panel picked up, at least for the first hour. I stopped watching at about, 9:45 Pacific, 12:45 Eastern, because I had to walk the dog. But it was like, I saw these people say they're still going in on SMU. But here was the thing. If you actually just looked at the bracket and later the rankings that came out, if you just looked at the bracket, looked at the rankings, do you notice something? We have the bracket on the screen. Do you notice who's the 5 seed? That would be the first at-large bid. It was the loser of the SEC championship game. So guess what? Texas was not at all punished at all for losing in a conference championship game. If you actually break it down, Texas has nothing on their resume that says they should be the highest ranked at-large team. You can look at Tennessee's resume. It's better than Texas's. You can look at Ohio State's resume. I've been critical of Ryan Day. It's better than Texas's. You can look at Penn State's resume, and it's better than Texas. And so I only bring it up to say that if you're going to tear down SMU, can you at least acknowledge that nobody that played in a conference championship game got punished? Texas didn't. They're the top at-large team. Penn State didn't. They're the second highest at-large team. And so listen, I think we can argue about the value of conference championship games. I think we can argue about should you be punished or should you not? But if you're not going to punish one team, you can't punish the others. Like it's common sense. If you're not going to punish Texas, you can't punish SMU. If you're not going to punish Penn State, you can't punish SMU. By the way, I noticed this in the final top 25 rankings. You know who else didn't drop out? Iowa State, who lost in the Big 12 championship game. UNLV, who lost in the Mountain West championship game as well. So that's a lot of yelling. That's a lot of screaming. But to the debate about SMU versus Bama, did they get it right? Yes, they got it right because they backed themselves into a corner. It was the only option they had, and it would just transparently be clear SEC bias. And I haven't looked at the comments in a minute. We'll get to some of your comments after the break. But like the idea that they should do anything other than put SMU in if they were going to put in Texas and Indiana and Notre Dame, kind of a no-brainer. Sucks for Alabama. Don't lose to Vandy and Oklahoma at home. Sucks for Ole Miss. Don't lose to Kentucky at home. By the way, Lane Kiffin, I have a Lane Kiffin tweet. It's not necessary. Like Lane Kiffin's still whining. It's like, bro, don't lose to Kentucky at home. It's that simple, and you're in. I've said it. I actually feel worse for South Carolina, and we're going to talk about South Carolina on the other side because I do think that the committee got it right. We have our 12-team field, but I think we've learned 3 things about what need to change going forward. And then from there, we're going to look at this bracket really quick. We'll take some of your questions, and I want to just start talking about matchups, how things look, how things are going to break, all that. Speaking of break, we're going to take a quick break. We will get to your questions. Be right back. All right, we're going to get back to the show in a minute, but before we do, many of you ask me all the time, Torres, what can I do to help support the show? You give me hours and hours and hours of content every single week. What can I do to help you? Well, I'll tell you what, do me a quick favor. Check out the Aaron Torres Media merchandise store for all of your team-specific shirts, hats, and more, all available at aarontorresonline.com/merchandise. A lot of you wondering, Torres, what can I get in that merch store? Well, first of all, we got our brand new Hope and Pope Kentucky basketball t-shirts. That's right. Mark Pope has arrived. He is here to save the day. Get your Hope and Pope t-shirts there. Also, Arkansas fans, the Big Pig Invasion is here. You can get your tees there. Basketball School Alabama shirts. Maura Hurley 2024 UConn shirts for your tailgates at Rentschler Field, your games at the XL Center or Gamble. And oh, by the way, your Mike effing Woodson gear for Indiana. If you love football, we got you covered too. We got more Dion shirts and hats than we even know what to do with. The freeze warning has hit the plains. Auburn fans, grab your freeze warning tees now. And of course, our new era, new rules shirt, applies to Nebraska football and its incredible fan base. We have more coming for the fall, plenty in stock right now. So make sure to check out the Aaron Torres Media merch store at aarontorresonline.com/merchandise. And you can always hit me up with any questions. Aaron Torres Podcast Questions. All right, everybody. I'm back. Good to be back. Tell you what, producer Matt, before we move on with tonight's show, let's go ahead and get to some questions because I have a feeling it appears as though it's a very passionate, group in the chat. So let's go ahead and see what some of the best questions and comments are. All right. Hedemy, I don't know how to pronounce your name, brother. 870 says, strength of schedule and rank wins don't matter as long as you win. This is what the committee is telling us. So from now on, SEC teams need to schedule the easiest games we can. I'll tell you what, hold that thought because I actually have a thought on that. And I do think while I was critical of both SMU and Texas's resume, I do think there's a bigger picture conversation about how we even select teams. Now, listen, I don't know how long this 12-team playoff is going to last. I don't know how soon Greg Sankey blows the whole thing up and says, I'm taking my ball and going home. I think this is a very good point. Producer Matt, hold this comment because I think this is a broader conversation that we have to have in a second. Do we have anything else? Corey Vaughn, did SMU play a single top 25 team? Well, they played one last night. Played BYU. They went 0-2. Teams that are currently ranked in the top 25, they went 0-2. Corey, I'm not here to argue that SMU just beat the 85 Bears or the 2019 LSU Tigers. What I'm here to say is neither did Texas. There is literally nothing on Texas's resume that is more impressive than SMU. I'm not arguing that SMU had to be in over Alabama or had to be in over Ole Miss. But what I will say, if you're not going to put in SMU because they didn't win a single game against a ranked opponent during the season, then you have to make the same argument for Texas. You have to make the same argument for Indiana. And it can't be brand bias or conference bias. It can't be, well, Indiana stinks. Well, why do they stink? They haven't been a ranked team. Okay. Should they be out? Yeah, they should be out. Okay. Well, what about Texas? Well, no, Texas should be in. But Texas also hasn't won a game against a ranked opponent all year. Well, Texas is in the SEC. Well, yeah, but they lost to a bunch of bad teams in the SEC. Well, but they because that was what like I said, I hosted radio for 3 hours on Saturday night. We took calls. My own co-host, Jason Martin, who I love to death, I pinned him into a corner on this exact thing. I said, if SMU's 11-2, 0-2 against top 25 teams, what about Texas 11-2, 0-2 against top 25 teams? Every caller on the show, but Texas is in the SEC. It's like, yeah, but they lost the only two games that mattered on their schedule. And I'm not saying Texas should be out. But what I am saying is if Texas is in, then SMU has to be in as well. Anything else, Matt, before we get to some stuff? Big Ten bias committee made a Big Ten bias bracket. Can I just say something really quick? I don't think there was Big Ten bias because I think that transparently, based on the decisions that the committee made, early in the process about how they were going to value teams. Indiana was going to get in. Penn State was going to get in. And by the way, all of this happened after Ole Miss took the loss to Florida, after Alabama took the loss to Oklahoma. It's pretty transparent. If Alabama doesn't lose to Oklahoma, not only are they in, they're in ahead of SMU. They're probably in ahead of Indiana. They're maybe in it. I don't want to say ahead of Penn State because they made the conference championship game. Like you could legitimately argue, Alabama would have been in ahead of 3 or 4 teams. So I don't think there's Big Ten bias. I do want to get to my thoughts in a second, but what I will say, that there is one thing that kind of struck me. I was a little bit surprised by with this process. I was kind of surprised. I didn't really hear anybody make the definitive argument that Notre Dame kind of has no resume. Like Notre Dame is just national punching bag every single year during college football playoff conversations. I actually think they're pretty good this year. I actually think they could beat Georgia in round 2, depending on the health of Carson Beck and the health of that quarterback room. But if you actually look at Notre Dame's resume, it's pretty weak. Texas A&M, no longer ranked. You obviously have by far the worst loss out of everybody in this conversation. I make fun of Ole Miss losing to Kentucky. Losing to Northern Illinois is 1,000 times worse. You do beat Louisville. Louisville was ranked when you played them, but the only team that you beat that is currently ranked is Army. That's the only team that's currently ranked. By the way, beat USC in what was a down year for USC, beat Florida State in which was literally a historically bad year for Florida State. Georgia Tech, obviously pretty good because Georgia Tech, we know what they just did to Georgia a few weeks ago, almost beat them. But I look at Notre Dame and I'm actually I don't think there was really a debate that they shouldn't be in, but I was just surprised more people weren't more passionate about Notre Dame not being in or being in. Producer Matt, anything else before we switch gears? Because I do want to get a lot of these comments are kind of getting some of the changes. Here we go. Neither SMU or Clemson should be in the playoff period. They are imposters. The auto bid system is absolute trash. Well, first of all, real quick, I will say a couple things. One, again, if you're arguing SMU shouldn't be in, there is literally not one argument that you can make that Texas should be in. So that's one. But two, speaking of auto bids, what I want to do is switch gears. Producer Matt, get this timestamp because I think this is going to be a nice little clip for us. And what I do want to talk about is everything that has happened over the last couple weeks and why I think there are really, in my opinion, 3 changes that have to be made going forward in this entire process. Now, some of it is before the bracket comes out. Some of it is after the bracket comes out. Because I think, listen, and I'm not Mr. Bash the committee. I actually think the committee, they were consistent. We can disagree with their consistencies and what they valued, but they were consistent. But I do think this is year 1 of a 12-team playoff, and I do think there are things that absolutely have to change going forward. The first thing that, in my opinion, has to change, what I believe this whole conversation, and it kind of goes against what I just talked about to lead the show. We have to stop valuing teams solely on wins and losses, and more wins equals better team. Now, like I said, I spent a whole segment saying SMU and Texas and Indiana didn't play anybody. But based on the criteria that the committee decided on very early in the process, it was clear. The more wins you have in a power conference, the more likely it is that you are to get in. And I just don't think we can think that way. I just think we have to do more critical thinking because, as Nick Saban said on the broadcast, he said, all wins are not created equal. I would add this, all losses are not created equal as well. And what do I mean by that? It is that if you just look at how teams were seeded and how teams were ranked, again, it was just who has the most wins. And, and so I look at, let me put it this way, right? Let's take out SMU. SMU's everybody's punching bag today. I think based on the criteria they should have been in. Let's look at Texas. Texas, as I've said 100 times, Texas finished the season, including the SEC championship game, 11-2. They finished playing a grand total of 2 teams that were ranked in the top 25 and went 0-2 against them. It was one team twice. It was Georgia early in the season. They lost to them at home. And then it was Georgia on Saturday in not the Georgia Dome, Mercedes-Benz Stadium in Atlanta. So Texas went 0-2 against top 25 competition. And so I bring it up because, and I tweeted this out as well. If you actually, now listen, I'm not saying you should punish teams that make a conference championship game. But what I will say is you look at Texas and you look at somebody like South Carolina. There is literally nothing on Texas's resume that is more impressive than what South Carolina did, other than the fact that they have more wins and 1 fewer loss, but that's solely a byproduct of the schedule. And so to me, this is number 1. We have to stop overvaluing just strictly wins and losses. Look at South Carolina. South Carolina, to their credit, they had a couple wins over ranked opponents. South Carolina, to its credit, look at who they beat throughout the regular season, especially late. Put aside the fact that they were the hottest team in the SEC late. They beat Missouri, who's ranked in the top 25. They beat South Carolina, Clemson, who's ranked in the top 25. They have 2 wins that are better than anything Texas did. By the way, to be fair to Texas, 2 wins that are better than anything Indiana had. 2 wins that are better than anything that that Penn State had. So you go on and on down the list. And it's like, why is South Carolina auto-slotted behind not only Texas, SMU, Indiana, Penn State, etc. It's because we value just wins and losses too much. Again, let's just stick with the SEC team so we know there's no pro SEC bias, right? If you gave Texas South Carolina's schedule, do you think they would have gone 11-2 like they did this year and go to the SEC championship game? Because I watched Texas against Arkansas. They didn't really move the ball. I watched Texas against Vandy. They had to rally. So now you got to go to Alabama. You got to go to you got to get Ole Miss and LSU at home. I think they're probably about 9-3 as well. And then the counter to that is you give South Carolina Texas's schedule. Well, a lot of common opponents that they beat worse than Texas did. They beat Texas A&M worse than Texas did. They beat Oklahoma worse than Texas did. So you go on and on down the list. I think that is one thing that the committee, when they get together next year, it has to be a deeper dive than just this team has won more games, so they have to be better. That's not how it works. That's not what we believe. But I also think that's something that you have to establish early in the process. It can't be you move teams around in the final week. It has to be, hey, early on, we start to realize that, hey, maybe Indiana's resume is a little thinner than we thought. Maybe we shouldn't just keep moving up SMU because they're beating bad ACC teams. Maybe we shouldn't just keep moving up Texas because they keep beating bad SEC teams. So that's change number one. Change number two kind of plays into this same one. It is the biggest mistake that the committee made. I didn't understand it in real time. We talked about it last week. I think it was a mistake, and they couldn't go back on it once they said it publicly, is that they basically acknowledged that nothing that happened this weekend for teams that were not playing would change their seeding. Now, you might sit there and say, Torres, why would the seeding change for teams that did not play? Well, the reason is simple. Take any of those teams, Alabama, Miami, South Carolina, Ole Miss, could be anybody, Indiana. Just because Ohio State, just because they're not playing does not mean that their resume is complete. So you look at somebody like South Carolina, go back to our shows last week. I talked about it last week when we were talking about the day after the final set of rankings came out. I said, first of all, South Carolina got zero credit for beating a top 15 Clemson team on the road 2 weeks ago. But at the same time, here's the other thing. Clemson still had a game to play. And so South Carolina's resume is not complete. The resume looks better because, one, you beat the SEC champ, or the ACC champ, excuse me. And two, you just beat a team that in Clemson that SMU lost to on Saturday. So of course, South Carolina's resume was not complete. And oh, by the way, they now have what should be a great win over Clemson and should be a punishing win over SMU. I keep saying it. I think South Carolina got screwed more than anybody, and I understand the head-to-head wins over Alabama and Ole Miss. I'm just saying is that they played a lot of tough teams. They beat a lot of tough teams, but I also think they just got screwed because we basically said that nothing that happens this weekend matters going forward. And so I think we truly have to never again say that the final weekend doesn't matter. I think it should matter for seeding. Listen, I'm not saying Texas should have been knocked out of the playoff, but again, if you actually look at Texas's resume, you can say we're not punishing them for playing Georgia and also acknowledge that with that extra game, that Texas's resume is worse than Tennessee's. Texas's resume is worse than Ohio State. Texas's resume is worse than whoever. Those are teams that are off the top of my head. Penn State, by the way, like how does Ohio State's resume not improve by Penn State losing? Like, how does Ohio State, I'm anti-Ryan Day as anybody, but Ohio State, he should probably jump over Penn State based on the fact that they beat him head to head. So that is change number two. Change number three, and producer Matt, go ahead and pop up the bracket again if you don't mind, because I do think my change number three would be something that everybody in college football is talking about. And it's something that I was a little hesitant to. I was obviously aware of, but now that we have the bracket, I think we have to reconsider. I do think we have to reconsider giving the 4 top seeds and the 4 first-round buys, as long as we have a 12-team playoff. I think we have to reconsider giving the 4 top seeds and the 4 first-round buys to the highest-ranked conference champions. And I'll be transparent. If you talked to me 2-3 weeks ago, I said this isn't a big deal. It happens in every single sport that certain teams in every division gets some sort of representation, whatever. Look at the NFL. the NFC South stinks. Whether it's the Falcons, whether it's the Bucks, whether it's whoever, somebody's going to get not only into the playoffs and a first round bye. And so I said, if the Atlanta Falcons could get a first round home playoff game, I don't want to hear sympathy that Boise is getting a first round bye. But what has happened, and this was something a lot of people have talked about since August, and I fundamentally agree with them now that we have a bracket, there is no doubt that the 5 seed and some of the other seeds actually have an easier draw than the number 1 overall seed. Oregon, think about Oregon. Oregon goes undefeated, only undefeated team in FBS football, wins the Big Ten championship. In the process, beats Penn State, Ohio State, and Michigan. I saw this stat. They're the first team in college football history to beat Penn State, Ohio State, Michigan, and Michigan State in the same season. That's an incredible stat. Well, what's their reward? They get an extra week off, and then they go to the Rose Bowl where they're playing either Tennessee or Ohio State. An Ohio State team, by the way, that easily could have beaten them in Eugene in week 7 or 8 whenever they played. And so, listen, a lot of people have argued this, and I think there's something to it. You look at Texas's draw. Would you rather be Texas as the 5 seed and have to play early in the tournament with Clemson at home and then Arizona State? Or would you rather be Oregon and get Ohio State and Tennessee, or Tennessee in the second round even after a bye? And so what I do believe we should get auto bids. Okay. That is something that I think the gentleman who commented earlier was Corey, get rid of the auto bids. I disagree. I think that, listen, the reason we expanded this playoff, we wanted to get away from the regionality of college football. We wanted to include everybody. And so I have no problem with eliminating I have no problem with keeping the auto bids, right? Because again, every sport has auto bids. You win the AL East, you get into the MLB playoffs, even if you're an 81-81 team. You win the Big East tournament as the 9 seed. That's how they crown an auto bid, and the Big East gets an auto bid. But if you think, let's just think about college basketball. The difference between this tournament and college basketball is if Duke and North Carolina are the 2 best teams all year, and Duke gets the auto bid out of the ACC, that doesn't preclude North Carolina from getting the number 1 seed, getting a number 1 seed themselves, or getting a 2 seed. They don't automatically fall to the 7 line in the NCAA tournament because they didn't win their conference championship. So what I would like to see is the 4 highest ranked teams. Now, what I will say, I do think it would take some critical thinking from the committee to not just slot the 2 SEC and Big Ten champs, and then the SEC and Big Ten runners up, because this year the 4 highest ranked teams are the SEC champ Georgia, SEC runner up Texas, Big Ten champ Oregon, Big Ten runner up Ohio State, or Penn State, excuse me. I think it would take a little bit more critical thinking than that, but I will not argue that Oregon does have the toughest draw in this bracket, because I just think that's something that does have to be reconsidered. Again, maybe the top 4 teams get an at-large bid, or get an automatic bid. Let me say this again. The top 4 teams get the first round bye, but I still think we should have auto bids. I don't think Boise and Arizona State are some of the greatest stories that we have in this 12-team bracket. But yeah, that's what I think. One quick real last thought, and we will get to some of your questions if you guys have any more questions or comments about this bracket. By the way, we got 2 full weeks to break down the bracket. This is not the night that we're going to just go, balls to the wall, previewing, Clemson, Texas. But I just mentioned that I think Oregon has the easiest draw. What I want to do now is talk about just the way I do think that it's interesting. I will say, just because of the way college football is this year, outside of Oregon, there might not be a great team. And you know who I actually think has the easiest draw in this entire tournament? Producer Matt, you can pop up the graphic again real quick of the bracket. You know who I actually think has the easiest draw out of everybody? I actually think it's Penn State, which has SMU and then Boise in round 1. So before I get to Penn State, I want to talk about everybody else. Texas, Clemson. First of all, I've seen a lot of Texas as the number 5 seed has the easiest draw. I disagree. Now, I think it's easier than Oregon's draw as the 1 seed. I think that's stupid. I think that needs to change. But what I would also say, I don't think Texas versus Clemson's like a walkover. Like we just talked about South Carolina, how good they are. Remember, Clemson had South Carolina beat into the final 2 minutes of that game. And I look at Texas, and there's maybe a conversation to have Tuesday, Wednesday this week. There is something not right with Texas's quarterback situation right now. Quinn Ewers, I tweeted this. I was on a tweet storm all weekend long, but I said, how many quarterbacks right now, if you gave this quarterback Texas's skill position guys, Texas's O-line, and Steve Sarkisian calling plays, how many quarterbacks could do as good or better than Quinn Ewers? So I'm not sold that Texas is just going to destroy Clemson, because Texas, there's something not right with that offense. And then even with Arizona State, I think they'd take care of Arizona State, but I don't think it's a cakewalk for Texas. Obviously, we've talked about Oregon, Ohio State, Oregon, Tennessee. Whatever Oregon draws, I actually think is going to be a little bit of a tough challenge for Oregon. With Ohio State, obviously, it goes without saying, that was a game earlier in the year where where Oregon could have lost. And we've talked about the Ohio State-Oregon game enough from the Ohio State perspective the last few weeks. Obviously, Ohio State, Will Howard doesn't get down in time to kick the field goal. There was a questionable pass interference call on Ohio State. So Oregon easily could have lost that game at home. And Tennessee's obviously no pushover with James Pierce on that defense. The defense has been elite. Nico's been good, et cetera, et cetera. Bottom part of the bracket, I'll say this. I do think if I had one game that I just don't see any degree of upset potential, I don't see Indiana going to Notre Dame and beating Notre Dame. Now, I think it's interesting, by the way. Apparently, I don't know enough about the history of those two schools, but from my understanding, Indiana and Notre Dame fans really do not like each other. Maybe most specifically, I don't think Indiana fans like Notre Dame fans. I think Indiana fans think Notre Dame, it thinks that they're better than them, holds themselves in a higher regard, whatever. But I just bring it up because I think Notre Dame gets to round two, and I saw a lot of, well, Georgia, Georgia's got a cakewalk maybe to the championship game. It's like, I don't really see that at all. Notre Dame, I think, can go beat Georgia. Listen, Georgia was awesome on Saturday, but a couple things. One, we don't know the status of Carson Beck. Now, you could argue that maybe Georgia's better without Carson Beck than is with Carson Beck. But at the same time, even so, if they play Notre Dame, you can make fun of Notre Dame. Notre Dame's got real dudes on that defense and real dudes in that secondary. A pair of pick sixes against USC. And Georgia's been so inconsistent all year. I don't know what I'm getting from them week to week. We can sit there and say, well, they just beat Texas. Well, they also should have and maybe could have lost to Georgia Tech under different circumstances. Well, they beat this team. Well, yeah, they could have lost to Kentucky on the road as well. Well, they beat that team. Well, they also lost to Alabama in a game where they didn't show up until the second half. Well, what about this? Well, they would have lost to Florida if DJ Lagway didn't get hurt. So to me, Georgia, I think you can argue they're right up there with Ohio State as far as the highest ceiling, and Oregon too, but Georgia probably has the highest ceiling of anybody in this tournament. But also, I do think there are questions about Oregon or about Georgia and how consistent they are. What's the quarterback situation? So I don't think that this game against Notre Dame would be a pushover, which brings me to Penn State SMU. Listen, I'm not saying any draw is easy, and I've obviously spent a lot of today's show defending SMU, but there's a couple things here. One, Penn State, to their credit, was anybody else kind of surprised at how that Big Ten championship game went? Now, Penn State covered. Best Bets went 4-1 this weekend, by the way. But, I think it's time to acknowledge, Penn State kind of moved the ball in that game, and maybe they're finally starting to figure things out. Drew Aller did have 2 picks, but he threw for 226 yards and 3 touchdowns. Penn State was able to run the ball to a tune of 9 yards per carry against Oregon. So one, I think Penn State is actually playing really well, even though they lost that game to Oregon. SMU, will see. Obviously, they're re-energized, but this will be, with respect to Clemson, the best defense that they've faced all year. I don't know that they can move the ball. But then Penn State gets a very manageable game in round 2 against Boise State. And so you look at how the bracket plays out for Penn State. It's listen, the Boise State story is awesome. First year head coach, Ashton Genty, we know all that. But I watched that conference championship game, and as good as it was, as fun as it was, do you think that Boise can move the ball on that Penn State defense? Because I'm not sure that they can. I don't know that their quarterback's dynamic enough. So I actually look at that, and I think that Penn State maybe actually has the best draw out of anybody. But those are some of my early thoughts. Listen, I'll just be quick. We're going to preview these games. I think Clemson can upset Texas. I think Ohio State, I saw Ohio State's a 7-point favorite over Tennessee. I know they're at home. That feels preposterous to me. I think Georgia could get upset by Notre Dame. So I think I'll say this. I was anti 12 team playoff. I was anti expansion. Those first round games 2 weeks from now should be a lot of fun. And I cannot wait to watch. Really quickly, producer Matt, before we get out of here, any quick questions, follow-ups, thoughts, etc. From tonight? Any interesting comments? Let's see what we got here. Let's see here. Clemson, SMU, and Boise and Indiana are trash. We want the best teams or not. Chance, let me ask you a question. What makes you think that Texas should be in, but SMU, Boise, Indiana, and Clemson should be out? That's my only question. What about Texas? Because they look good walking into the building? Because they got a couple dudes that are rated high on an NFL draft board? Because I've seen them twice against Georgia. Couldn't move the ball in either game. If your argument is that, first of all, I think we need auto bids. I've seen all these SEC teams play each other. I don't need 9 SEC teams in a 12-team field. I'm sorry if that hurts anybody's feelings. I don't. And by the way, all these SEC teams, Lane Kiffin, I see Lane Kiffin running his mouth on Twitter. Lane Kiffin, don't lose at home to Kentucky. You're in. It's not an issue. You know the difference between Tennessee and Ole Miss? One's in the playoff and one isn't. It's because one beat Kentucky at home and one didn't. So, I saw all these SEC teams play each other. We don't need 9 of them. It's going to be okay. Take a deep breath. Chance, get your pacifier. Suck your thumb. You're going to be fine. It's okay. It's not that big of a deal. And again, if you're arguing SMU shouldn't be in, that's fine. But tell me what Texas has done to deserve a shot at this playoff. A couple more, we'll get out of here. It's been a fun show. Todd Johnson. Thank you, freaking Todd Johnson. He says you never know how these teams are going to match up. That's why they play the games. This was my thing when I was on social media on what's today? Today was Sunday. I saw all this. Well, if SMU played Alabama, Alabama would be a 20-point favorite. Alabama would be a double-digit favorite. Alabama was double-digit favorite against Vandy. Did you watch the game? Because Alabama lost. Alabama was a double-digit favorite against Oklahoma. Did you watch the game? Alabama didn't score a touchdown. Ole Miss was a double-digit favorite against Kentucky at home. They lost. Kentucky never won an SEC game after that the rest of the season. Ole Miss, you want me to keep going? Double-digit favorite against Florida on the road. I think they were 9.5 technically by the time of kickoff. Ended up losing outright. So, Todd, thank you. You never know how these games are going to play. That's why they play the games. I agree. I think Clemson can upset Texas. I think Tennessee can upset Ohio State. It's like if we're just going to play the games on paper, why do we even play a season? Just let Vegas determine who the champion is in the preseason. They would have given the trophy to Ohio State. By the way, Ohio State was a 22-point underdog favorite or against Michigan at home, and they lost. It's why we play the games. Thank you, Todd. Keith, ACC championship game featured 2 teams with 0 wins against the top 25. Well, that's how the cookie crumbles sometimes, Keith. That's how the cookie crumbles. Texas shouldn't have gotten in. And what I will say really quick, because I don't mean to keep belaboring this point. We'll get to that Bama question in a second, producer Matt. I don't mean to keep belaboring the Texas point. I think this is a bigger conversation about imbalanced scheduling in this expanded conference era. It was funny. I was thinking about this. Let's just take half a second, right? We can make fun of SMU schedule. We can make fun of this team because they sucked this year. But let's take Florida State, right? First of all, Florida State in the preseason looked like a great game on people's schedules. Look at Florida State's schedule. Here is who Florida State played. SMU in the playoff. Clemson in the playoff. Miami finishes as a top 15 team. Notre Dame in the playoff. Florida, one of the hottest teams in college football. Georgia Tech easily could have beaten Georgia. And so I just bring it up because look at that in the ACC. How Florida State got Miami, Clemson, SMU, Georgia Tech, who's pretty good, and somehow Miami, Clemson, and SMU did not play each other. That's just going to be a byproduct. And again, and this was maybe a point that I could have made better earlier when we were talking about the fact that we can't just rank teams based on wins and losses. There has to be context behind it. This is going to keep happening in the expanded conference era. There's going to be an Indiana every year, a Texas every year, where just the way the schedule breaks, they're not going to play anybody. And I don't think there's anything we can do about it. Now, how much should they be punished? That's a different conversation. But if you think this Indiana thing, if you think the Texas thing, you think the SMU thing is a one-off deal, it's just not going to be in this 12-team playoff era. What was the Bama question, Matt? I hear Bama is taking it well. They're not even bothered. Listen, I mentioned it earlier. Our Torres on Bama account. And to be clear, since people don't seem to understand this, we have interns running all those pages. I help out. I share my content. But when something big happens, I let the interns, I let the admins cook. Okay, I remember when Texas A&M, when Jim Schlossnagle, the baseball coach, left for Texas, I let my A&M guy loose. I said, go be an A&M fan. If you're mad, don't no expletives, don't threaten any family members, but be an A&M fan. I bring it up because our Torres on Bama page on Sunday, ooh, buddy, he was not happy. And I love Drew. He's the best, one of our really good interns in our program, and he's going to do great things. But yeah, Bama fans are not taking it well. Listen, what was funny? So another guy that I love, Ryan Fowler, best in the business, hosts in Tuscaloosa radio Monday through Friday, 2 to 6 Central Time. We had him on our radio show on Saturday night, and Ryan basically made the argument, well, you have to put them in because there's going to be hell to pay with Greg Sankey. It's like, I mean, yeah, Greg Sankey's probably going to try to change up the format of this playoff, and he's probably going to get his way. It doesn't change the fact that, it doesn't mean that Alabama should be in. Alabama lost 2 games to really bad teams. Now, Alabama has great wins. Alabama has the win over South Carolina. Alabama has the win over Georgia. They also have a win over Oklahoma and Vandy. That's one thing we talked about on Thursday's show. We did not talk about it today. I don't think got talked about enough is the idea that it wasn't just that Alabama had 3 losses. It was who specifically they lost to. It's hard to defend Alabama when Alabama's losses, 2 of them are to unranked teams, 6-6. Alabama wasn't one of the best teams in the country this year. They might have had one of the best resumes. They're not one of the best teams. I shed 0 tears. I think I said it all week. I think South Carolina had more of an argument than Alabama did. Now, I know Alabama had the head-to-head win, but I also think you look at South Carolina's total body of work, how they're playing now, they were the better team. So, yeah, to Rum's point, yeah, I don't think Alabama fans are doing too well right now. Here's the secret. Here's the secret sauce to making sure this doesn't happen next year. Don't lose to Vandy, and then you'll be just fine. Anything else, Matt, before we get out of here? Cameron Smith with the emoji face saying, people who slander SMU without knowing anything about ball. LOL. Cameron Smith, I don't know if you are an SMU fan, but if you are, man, congratulations. And if you're not, I think Cameron Smith's point is well taken. I think the theme of today's show, you can argue SMU shouldn't have been in, but every single argument that you would use against SMU being in, you would have to use against 2 or 3 other teams as well. We've already talked about it time and time again. Indiana, 0 wins over top 25 teams. Texas, 0 wins over top 25 teams. Penn State's best win, Illinois. Who else? Notre Dame's best win, Army. I support the troops. Don't know if I support that Army schedule, though. Maybe we get to one more and we get out of here, producer Matt. Middle of the road SEC teams could win this tournament. It's weak. I don't think that's factually correct. I don't think Alabama could win this tournament. I don't think Alabama was too inconsistent, and there was such an obvious way to beat Alabama. Slow down Jalen Milroe. You can absolutely win this. You can absolutely beat Alabama. Ole Miss, I think, was interesting, but Ole Miss had some really bad games. Lost to Kentucky at home. By the way, the Florida game, tried to give it away 10 times. The fact that they were even in it late was kind of a miracle. I think Ole Miss maybe could win it. I'm champions. I'm not going to fight with you too much on this one because I think there are some teams that could win it. But I also think if you're not in it, you can't argue. I mean, you could do this in the NFL. There's some team every couple of years that gets left out because they started out really slow. They're playing hot late, and it doesn't matter. I don't know what to tell you. Ole Miss, don't lose to Kentucky. Every game, as it turns out, 12-team playoff year, apparently every game does matter just like it used to. If Ole Miss beats Kentucky, they're in. SMU's probably out. And Ole Miss has a chance. Anything else? Jamie Harper, this is a great point. Clemson is playing with house money right now. They got a miracle last week from Syracuse and they cashed it in. So I picked Clemson to win that game. And that was against SMU. And that was essentially my argument. Was basically that like if you listen to Dabo Swinney's media availability last week going into the SEC championship game, he basically acknowledged, he's like, after we lost to South Carolina, we were down. We're not going to the conference championship game. We're not going to the playoff. All of our goals, we haven't been met. And he said, as they played a noon Eastern game against South Carolina, they end up losing. The Miami-Syracuse game is a 3:30 Eastern game. And he said, as the Miami-Syracuse game was going on, he started to get calls. He started to get texts. Oh, my goodness, we might. And then you could tell by the time they played, they were loose. They were relaxed. They were happy. And I think there's something to that with Texas. Texas is a good team, but Texas has obvious flaws starting at the quarterback position. Again, this might be a Tuesday, Wednesday, maybe next week topic. I think they should seriously consider moving off of Quinn Ewers for this college football playoff and giving Arch a chance. I've seen the Quinn Ewers experience. It ain't good enough to win 4 straight games. All right, I'll tell you what. I think it's time for me to get out of here. Just did an hour live, a lot of reaction, a lot of yelling, a lot of screaming. Had to make fun of everybody at ESPN because some of them are just not very good at their jobs. I'm not going to name names. Maybe rhymes with Schmoey Schmalloway. That guy needs to not be on TV anymore, but that's another conversation for another day. Tell you what, if you're not subscribed to the Aaron Torres Sports Podcast, do me a quick favor. Please make sure that you are subscribed. Apple, Spotify, Amazon Music, Google Music, wherever you get your podcast, please make sure to subscribe to the Aaron Torres Pod. Also, make sure to rate and review the show. Go ahead, give us a quick 5 stars. Let us know what you like, what you don't like, all that good stuff. Make sure you're following on social media at Aaron_Torres on Twitter, at Aaron Torres Pod on Instagram, Aaron Torres Podcast Questions at gmail.com, Aaron Torres Podcast Questions at gmail.com. All for today's show. Appreciate everybody's support. It is time for me to get out of here. Shout out to Torrin Craig. Shout out to Rachel, who hates my voice. Shout out to JJ Reddick, you F-head. Unblock me, bro. By the way, on the podcast, we will have some bonus hoops coverage. By the way, saw my UConn Huskies. Apparently, they're not dead after all. They just beat Texas. And then also on top of that, Kentucky obviously gets the incredible win over Gonzaga. Let's see here really quick. Did Duke end up losing to Louisville? They're still playing, and I ain't staying on until that game goes final. They are up 7. So that's what we're going to do. I'm going to log off. If you're listening on podcast, a little bit of bonus hoops coverage. Appreciate everybody's support.